Yeah, so we're very pleased to have Bacchus with us. From a wide range of accomplishments. He is the Distinguished University Professor at the University of Central Florida and Director of the Center for Global Economic and Environmental Opportunity. He's a founding judge of the World Trade Organization, has adjudicated more World Trade Organization disputes than anyone else, a former member of the US Congress from Florida, has written a number of books, the latest of which is entitled Democracy for a Sustainable World, which he'll be telling us about today. And the way it's going to go is Jim is going to speak for around 20 minutes, and then we'll take Q&A for the rest of the time. And his request is that if you ask a question, please begin by telling him who you are. All right, Jim, please take it away.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back again in Cambridge, and especially to be here with you at this center. I greatly admire your work, and the first thing I want to say is a word of gratitude to Lord Rees for his very strong and generous support of my work and his enthusiastic endorsement of my book, which I'm proud to have on its back cover. Happy to be here with my increasingly famous friend, Luke Kemp. And I recommend his book, Elias, first to those of you who have not read it. And although he couldn't be with us today, I want to say how much I enjoyed, the book Pnyx by Thomas Moynihan. I follow the Sinner's work. I can't say I'm familiar with all of it, but I hope you will share more of it with me so that I become better educated about existential risks. The first chapter of my book is about existential risks, but I see no point in repeating any of that chapter today because you know far more about the issue than I do. I did my best to try to summarize the many pressing risks that we face and could face in the world. What I've tried to do in my book is address the issue of what we should do in response to those risks, how we should structure our governance. And my book, I'm told, is the first book to be written about the relationship between democracy and sustainable development. What do I see as that relationship? Well, I see the two as inextricably intertwined. I see them as being in a situation in which we cannot have one without also having the other. Why is that? What is that relationship that I see? First of all, I believe it's only through the broad human flourishing that we can derive from achieving the social, economic, and environmental goals of sustainable development that we have set for ourselves through the United Nations, that we can have the capability as individuals to make democracy truly effective. Secondly, I believe that it's only by practicing effective democracy that we can achieve that human flourishing through sustainable development. Again, we cannot have one without the other. As it stands, we don't have nearly enough of either of them. Where democracy in the world is, in my view, largely a pale imitation of what democracy should be. Even in the most democratic of our countries, there's a retreat from democracy into reactionary populism and worse, authoritarianism. And then, of course, most countries in the world do not have what can be described as any kind of a democracy, and the numbers of democracies are shrinking. So in the world, we have at best half democracies, and at worst, no democracy at all, or nominal democracies that only pretend to be democratic. They are actually different kinds of authoritarianism and statism. At the same time, although we set for ourselves the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations a decade ago this year. And although we were making some progress on quite a few of them up until the pandemic set us back, now we're falling even farther behind because of our retreat from the kind of human flourishing that gives us effective democratic governance. We can't trust authoritarian regimes to promote human flourishing because human flourishing is inconsistent without allowing others to tell you what to do, without having a say in the decisions yourselves. Again, I will recount all of the existential risks we face: climate change, biodiversity, loss. There's so many more. You here are experts on the fact that humanity throughout its history and its prehistory has always faced different kinds of risk, including existential risk. It becomes necessary for us to ask ourselves, what can we do to avert these risks? And to me, the only way to avert these risks is, by having a true democracy that leads to real human flourishing through sustainable development. Why do I feel this way? Well, I look around the world and what do I see? I see that the problems we have are problems that require collective action. Not action, for the most part, by individual nation states, but action by humanity as a whole, by cooperating and acting collectively. We're not doing that. We pretend to be doing it. We try to do it. I participated for decades with others in trying to do it. We've made some progress, but that progress is too little. There's a question as to whether it's too late. Certainly not enough. And as I look around the world, my conclusion is that the reason that we're not able to engage in the kinds of human actions that we must have is because of failures of governance. Virtually every risk we face is a victim of a failure of governance. Whether it's democracies or non-democracies, governments are failing to do what must be done to preserve humanity and preserve the planet and advance human civilization. Why is this? I've had the privilege in a long life of being entrusted with positions of responsibility legislatively, judicially, administratively, at every level of government, from the local to the global. And my conclusion from all of that experience is that what's missing in governance everywhere in the world is trust. People no longer trust their governments, including their democratic governments. They no longer trust the elites. They no longer trust scientists. They no longer trust educated experts. They no longer trust politicians. They no longer trust institutions. Least of all do they trust international institutions, such as the one I was privileged to serve for a decade, the World Trade Organization. In my view, it's a very fine institution. It can be much improved, but it's not trusted. And that's one reason why it's in peril now. The same is true of many other international institutions. So if the problem is governance, and if the problem of governance is a lack of trust, what is the remedy? The remedy is, of course, to increase and restore trust worldwide. How can this be done? Again, based on my own experience and my own thinking and reflection, I've concluded that the answer must be participation. I believe that it's time we took democracy seriously. What does that mean? The core principle of democracy is, of course, self-rule. If we look at our democracies today, even the best of them, can we say that people actually rule themselves? No, we can't. At best, they might have a reasonably representative form of representation, but even that is eroding. Look at what's happening with the competitive gerrymandering of the two parties in my own country right now. That's profoundly undemocratic of both the Democrats and the Republicans. I'm opposed to it. In all instances, now we retreat from democracy to something less than democracy. We are missing self-rule, and therefore what we need is the participation that can alone provide self-rule, because self-rule to me means being able to make the most possible decisions about your own lives that you can. And our forms of governance now do not do that. So we need more participation. Indeed, in my view, what we need is universal participation by all of humanity, all the more than 8 billion of us in the world, in deciding our future for ourselves. I believe everyone in the world should have an equal opportunity to participate in decision-making about their own future by participating in their own self-rule. How can we possibly do this? And here's where I come to the ancient Athenians, who, in most degree, invented democracy on one hillside, clear of a mile or so from the famous Acropolis in Athens, called the Pnyx, Pnyx. It's the subtitle of my book, The Path from the Pnyx. This happened in 508 BC when a renegade aristocrat named Cleisthenes came together with a lot of ordinary Athenian citizens, overthrew the landed aristocrats who had ruled Athens for centuries, and established what we would see as the first historical democracy. The first form of governance that we today, millennia later, can readily identify as democracy. But it was a democracy very much unlike what we have today. Let me hasten to say, before I describe what they did have, to underscore what they did not have. In that democracy, they excluded the participation of women. So that was half of the Athenians who were not citizens. They excluded the participation of immigrants called Pnyx. Aristotle was not an Athenian citizen because he was an immigrant. They weren't allowed to participate in the democracy. And of course, there were tens upon tens of thousands of enslaved people. They also did not have a say. They were not citizens, and they did not participate in the democracy. But when I was young and a graduate student in history at Yale, I had a famous professor named C. Van Woodward, one of the great historians in my country of the last century. And he taught us that in looking at the past, it's always vital not to look at where people were in terms of what they were doing and what they were not doing, what they believed and what they did not believe, but instead to look at the direction in which they were going. And for those minority of the people of Athens who were privileged to be citizens, at its height about 60,000 of them, they had the purest democracy that has ever existed. Today, only Switzerland comes remotely close to having what they had. The rest of the 190 odd countries in the world don't begin to have the kind of democracy the Athenians had. Well, what was unique about their democracy, and what is there about its uniqueness that we might use today in our own thinking about how we might reform our own civilization? First of all, they had a direct democracy. On that hill called the Pnyx, The Athenians assembled him, and their word was assembly, the word we've taken from them. And they did so 40, 50 times a year, early in the morning. And everyone who showed up, the Pnyx could accommodate about 6,000 citizens. So it was first come, first served. From the rural areas, they would come the night before and travel all night, 20, 30 miles, just to be there when the sun rose to participate in their own banquets. From the Agora, other urban residents of Athens would climb up the hillside to join in the assembly. And in that assembly, everyone was equal. Everyone had an equal say, everyone had an equal vote. In the early years, of course, the aristocrats still spoke the most, but the democracy lasted for 2 centuries, and it didn't fail. It was defeated ultimately by Macedon. The governance system itself did not fail. It was simply erased by its conquerors. They had some troubles along the way a couple of times, the Peloponnesian War, for example. But the second century of democracy was even more democratic than the first. And here I urge you to read the books of Josiah Ober, which are very good on this. And those on the hillside in the assembly decided the fate of the city-state. They voted up or down by show of hands. Exactly what the city-state would do, decisions on domestic policy, decisions on foreign policy. But that wasn't the entirety of the state. Of course, once you make a decision, you have to implement it. So the Athenians, this is significant and often overlooked, had a series of dozens of usually 10-member boards of citizens, magistrate boards, weights and measures, roads and bridges, dealing with food supply, dealing with water supply, all of the day-to-day issues of governance. And these 10-member boards were comprised of citizens who have been selected by sortition, by lot, what we today would call random selection. Citizens volunteered back in their villages or their wards, what were called demes, D-E-M-E-S. They volunteered to be put in the lottery. And thus they had an equal opportunity to serve with anyone else who volunteered. And the vast majority of people who were citizens volunteered because it was viewed as a shame not to serve. Socrates says this somewhere in words he either said or Plato gave him. But that was the point. If you didn't serve, then what use were you as a citizen? So just about everyone volunteered. And they would serve on these magistrate boards and also on the usually 600-member jury courts who were chosen from 6,000 people. I'm sorry, 500-member jury courts were chosen from 6,000 people who were randomly selected annually. All these people served as volunteers on a randomly selected basis for 1 year at a time. Then there was a rotation in office. You were limited to serving twice in a lifetime on different boards. And most of the Greek classicists have concluded that in their lifetimes, about a third or more of the Athenian citizens served at some point and actually in a position of executive governance in their city-state, in addition to being a member of the assembly. And beyond that, as Oprah points out, I think very persuasively in several of his books, the Athenian democracy created, in addition to its direct democracy, in addition to the sortition and random selection of its executive agencies, if you will, what we would today call a system, a network, an interlocking network of governance and non-governance, of cooperation throughout all the citizenry, seeping unavoidably into those who were not citizens, but also ended up participating in that book. And in his view, and that of many other classicists of ancient Athens, and this is why we remember Athens when we don't remember the vast majority of the other Greek city-states. What did Sparta really ever accomplish? I've been there. There's nothing there. It's because they really built nothing. They left nothing. They had no literature. They had, a poet or two. They had Lycurgus, supposedly, but we see mythical. There are a few buildings there, but they were the Romans' buildings after they conquered Greece. There's nothing there. But what would we have still today, millennia later, of ancient Athens? We have their philosophy, we have their art, we have their drama, we have their literature of all kinds. They invented history of them rereading Herodotus on the airplane. Some really good tall tales in here, but some of them actually true. And then, of course, Thucydides, who lived during the time of the Greek democracy, as did Herodotus, and so much more. And of course, governance, what they were able to achieve, and prosperity. It was because of the opening up of Athenian society that created more freedom of thought throughout most of the democracy, that they were able to engage in the invention and the innovation artistically and otherwise that they did. They were open to new ideas and new ways of doing things. Now, someone who has spent his life speaking of the virtues of open trade, I would say, and I'm not alone, that one of the reasons was because the Athenians became open to trade. And they opened their ports to trade, even though they didn't allow emigrants to become citizens. Mistake on their part. I often think that if the Athenians had allowed the people who were not citizens in Athens, and also those who were citizens of the islands and the other regions that became part of what became the Athenian Empire, that the empire would have lasted much longer than it did, and even rivaled, to an extent, ultimately, the Roman Empire, and perhaps prevented there being such a thing as the Roman Empire. That's a what if. Now, what can we learn from this experience today? Well, I think we already understand at some level, most of us, the virtues of direct democracy if it can be achieved. And we have in our country New England town meetings to this day. And if you read the founders of our republic, some of whom were slaveholders, some who did not live up to the full implications of their own thinking, just as Cleisthenes and the Athenians did not. Then you see that part of their reasoning for creating a republic, instead of an actual direct democracy, was they did not believe that a direct democracy could succeed on the scale of the 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard of their time. But nowadays, we have something called scientific random sampling. And I'm going to summarize briefly what I think we can do and then conclude. And then we can have around questions and answers and exchange of views. I think on a global basis, we need to create at every level of governance, randomly selected from volunteers numbering in the millions and millions ultimately, global circles of participation. And at the global level, these randomly selected circles of participation should be equal decision makers in international institutions with the current decision-making bodies in those institutions. And again, I stress, I believe we should ideally do this at every level of governance. Secondly, man is a part of nature. That's one of the things we need to learn if we're going to be able to avoid these existential risks we now face. So I believe that in each of these institutions at every level, we also must have what I would call circles of nature. That too would be randomly selected from volunteers. And I believe that these circles of nature should have advisory authority to these two decision-making bodies. One, the current decision bodies are formed by what I call right representation, which we can discuss later, and the other randomly selected, thus providing us with the benefits of both the best of individualism and collective wisdom to give us effective democratic governance. In addition to the circles of nature, I also believe we need circles for the future. It would give us a commitment to what those of us in sustainable development call intergenerational equity. But in layman's terms, would be caring about what happens to people who follow us, our children, our grandchildren, and their grandchildren. And these circles of nature, I think, also, these circles of the future, I think, should also be selected randomly from among volunteers aged 12 to 21 worldwide. And again, I believe that all of this can be done and should be done at every level of global governance. Lastly, obviously, I'm an optimist. As I explain at length in the book, I believe we have a duty of optimism. I believe this can be done. I've participated in many hopeless tasks in my life that through hard work and collective action did not turn out to be hopeless. The creation of the World Trade Organization, which took us 15 years. The establishment of an international space station, where we won by one vote on the floor of the House of Representatives after trailing by 120 votes at the outset. So I'm undeterred by the fact that people say these things are hard to do. We do things because they're hard, because they're easy. This is John Kennedy, not James Bacchus. And I believe we have to do them. Furthermore, I have concluded that this is the only true answer to our quandary today. Because if we don't do these things, then we might as well subject ourselves to the pessimism that threatens to overwhelm us. But I'm one of those people who believes that tomorrow can yet be better than today if we make it so. I'm going to stop here. There are 500 pages of the book and 100 pages of endnotes. So I've left a lot out. And then there's a lot that I think is not even in the book. So perhaps we can talk about some of that. But I'd be happy to respond to any of your questions. I can't promise you an answer. I will promise you a response.
The World Trade Organization isn't often thought of as being fundamentally democratic in that, for example, I remember watching documentaries.
It's no more or less democratic than any other international institution.
Well, about how it enforced trade laws, for example, on countries like Vietnam, saying that they had to have open markets for liquor and cigarettes.
The Vietnamese have agreed to the rules in the WTO treaty, and the WTO settlement system merely upholds those rules. The Vietnamese and every other member of the WTO, under the terms of the treaty, has a choice as to whether to comply with WTO rulings or not do so. But if they choose not to comply with the rulings and not fulfill some of their obligations under the contract that is the WTO treaty, then they stand to lose some of the benefits. That's how the system works. That's not related to whether the system is democratic or not. If the system were democratic, the enforcement system would probably be still the same.
But Vietnam doesn't have as much power in terms of how the legal structure of the WTO would be set up versus, say, the United States.
Well, actually, the WTO system would not have been set up unless Vietnam had agreed to it. Actually, Vietnam came into the WTO after the system had already been agreed to it. But 120 countries established the WTO, and it can only be established because all of them agreed to do so.
I guess.
Furthermore, developing countries feel like, unlike most other international institutions, they have actually more say in the WTO than they have elsewhere because they are equal all around the negotiating table. Now, having said all that in defense of the WTO, I should say what I say in the book. And keep in mind, I'm saying this as one of the founders of the WTO, one of the founders of the appellate body, the highest court of tribunal in the WTO, and twice the chief judge of the appellate body. I'm saying this. In addition to the structure we already have in the WTO, I would do two things. First of all, I would reform the existing body we have to make it more representative by requiring the nation states to be more representative in how they we choose those they delegate to that decision-making belonging in the WTO. But I would also establish a second decision-making body in the WTO by global sortition. As I explained in the book, I would have all these circles of participation be comprised of 151 people, randomly selected from volunteers, ultimately numbering in the millions, all over the world. And they would have equal decision-making power to all the ambassadors from all the nation states who currently have the sole decision-making power in the WTO. And that, I believe, will be democratic.
But the deeper point is the relationship between markets and governance. And if you could do something like this in terms of changing the structure of the WTO so that it was more representative, then that probably could be some kind of a beacon for other systems.
It would then be up to the sortition body to decide whether the current rules are fair. If they don't think they're fair, and I think there are many ways rules can be improved. I've written 5 other books to far about this one. You can read them. I explain this in detail. Trade, for example, my most recent book for this is simply a recitation of 400 pages of all the changes we must make in the WTO. I'm not viewed as a trade purist. But if they decided the rules needed to be changed, they could suggest changes. And if the others agreed, then the changes could be made. But it's also true that if the current representatives from the nation states wanted to make changes and agreed on those changes, then under the current system, they would be made. But under the new system, they would have to have the agreement of the sortition body as well. Now, some would say this makes it harder to make decisions. Well, how many decisions has the WTO made in the past 2 decades? Virtually none. I say that because it would help restore trust in the international institution back home in the nation states, then that will make it easier for the WTO to make decisions.
So I have 5 other questions that I'm going to turn it over, but if nobody else has questions, I can speak again.
No, I appreciate these questions. They give me a chance to elucidate. Yes.
It's not very well formed, sorry. The democratic model you're describing in ancient Greece, my assumption is that the people that were voting were making decisions that were locally relevant.
They were relevant to the whole city-state on both its domestic and its foreign policy. A decision of whether to go to war or not was made by the assembly. 1 person, 1 vote.
Because I think there's a slight danger in people voting, like having a decision-making power that exceeds the context in which they're familiar with and knowledgeable on. So in your model of democracy that you kind of posited today, how do you correct for some people not having an understanding of what the consequences of their decision?
First of all, I agree with Thomas Jefferson. I'm a Democrat with a little d, and I'm a real one. I believe that the remedy, if people are not as informed as they need to be able to make decisions, is not to prevent them from making decisions, it's to make them better informed. This is part and parcel of my lifelong commitment to education. The recent democratic theorist, other than Jefferson, who believed this most strongly, was a friend of mine named Benjamin Bartlett, who regrettably is no longer with us. I suggest, if you haven't done so, that you read his book, Strong Democracy, in which he makes the same point. And in my own structure, I haven't just suggested that we draw a volunteer from the African village one day, or East London one day, and we stick them in a global decision-making role the next day. I provide for a 2-year process in which only 1 year would be participating in decision-making role in the circle of participation. The final 3 months would be a period of accountability. I would have a code of ethics, full financial disclosure, borrow, lobbying, exclude all corporate influence. And then, as the Athenians did, I would have an accountability period at the end, 3 months, in which an investigation was made to see whether this particular person really did adhere to the code of ethics. And they say, take some money under the table, something of that sort. But the other 9 months up front would be a period of education in which at the first instance, the people themselves would say to themselves, well, I don't know anything about it. I need to know about it, and request information. And then we would have expert bodies that we selected. I have a long passage in the book about this, in a way akin to how the IPCC process works, with which you have some familiarity, I know, although most of these bodies will be smaller than the IPCC. And we would have such bodies for each of these international institutions. Some of them already have sort of prototypes of this now. The WTO is not, but it could, for example, and it would under my proposal. And so would all the UN agencies. The WTO is not a UN agency, as you probably know. And then if I, as someone from Orlando who had volunteered to have been selected, decided I needed to know more about existential risks, I would say, I need to know more about existential risk. This expert group, which one or two of you might be a part, would provide me with that information. That information will be provided equally to everyone else who had been selected, whether they had requested it or not. And furthermore, be put online. It will be visible to everyone in the world so they could weigh it for themselves. And then when we have these circles for participation meet, and indeed I would do the same for all international decision-making bodies, if I was having them all meet, as we Floridians say, in the sunshine, I would have open meetings, fully open meetings. There will be a broadcast that will be live streamed in real time to the whole world, except that they want to listen and can watch. So I would have a very visible form of governance that I think would further engender even more trust. And of course, those who study deliberative democracy, I know some of you do, know that when we truly have a deliberative process, participation itself isn't enough. You also have to have real deliberation, and there are rules for it. I have a whole chapter on this in the book, but John Dryzek and others have written tomes on these things. It's the process of deliberation that itself creates trust. If you feel you've had an equal say, if you feel you've been heard, if you feel your considerations and your views have been taken into account in making the final decision, then even if that decision is not entirely or even much of one you would have made, then you're going to trust it a lot more than if it's simply been imposed upon you. And there's a wealth of empirical evidence demonstrating this. So that's a part of that process too. And furthermore, if you're watching it on TV or online somewhere in the world, as people do this, then you're going to have someone who's going to articulate your view. Maybe you won't. I mean, random scientific sampling is the key to all this. And what matters with random scientific sampling, as we know, is not the size of the population, it's the size of the sample and whether the sample itself is random. This is why you could have a body of 151 people who represent 8 billion people in the world. Now, what does representative mean? Well, if you are, let's say you are a left-handed female carpenter from the North Island of New Zealand, there's probably not going to be another left-handed female carpenter from the North Island of New Zealand who's selected. There may be a left-handed female carpenter from the South Island of New Zealand, but that's not like being from the North Island, is it? So we can reduce identity to the point where we have 8.2 billion identities. And that's part of the mistake that's been made in my country by my party. We've forgotten that what unites us is supposed to be greater than all the divides. But you can, through scientific variable sampling, have a representative body that's reflective of the diversity of the sample and of the large population. So if you're out in the world, there's a good chance that your view, however semi-articulate you are about voicing it, is going to be voiced in this process, and you will know that it's heard, and you will see that it's considered. In dispute settlement in the WTO, when we judge cases, we would consider any argument that was heard at length, sometime for a day or two in oral hearings, even if the argument was absurd, because we thought it important that there be that element of due process. Now, despite my views, those dispute settlement hearings are still closed to popular viewing unless the parties to the hearings themselves agree that they should be open. First thing I did after leaving the appellate body in 2004 was write an op-ed in the Washington Post saying all these proceedings should be open. So 2 decades later, I'm simply repeating that view in this new book of mine. And I've repeated it previously in other books. But I think it's very important to speak a visible, transparent.
We have a question online from
Yes.
Do you want to read the question out now? Or we can read it for you.
I will read the question. Come on. It's Mel C's question.
That's
Okay. Don't show that idea. I still need to do it. Thank you for your talk. You're welcome. I found your proposed solutions particularly inspiring and thought-provoking. Thanks. Question. How would such multi-level changes in international governance begin, starting with what we have now? Do you have a developed theory of change? I have a partly developed theory of change, and it's partly developed because, and only partly developed, because I believe in learning by doing. I believe in bottom-up rather than top-down governance. And I think that the best chance we have of creating these kinds of participatory democracy are from the bottom up and not the top down. Where do I see evidence that this can happen? Well, remember, my book is about democracy and sustainable development and the relationship between the two. And I've been much involved in sustainable development efforts now since 1974. So that's a while, right? Half a century, since just after the Stockholm Convention in my home state of Florida, and then nationally and internationally. And I look out at the world now, and I see reason for optimism that others don't see. And I see it in the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of local and regional sustainable development networks that have emerged worldwide and are still emerging and are linking and increasingly scaling up. There are about 40, 50,000 that have been formally notified to the United Nations as actively working to achieve sustainable development goals. But there are many, many thousands more, indeed I did a number of them, that haven't reported to the UN, and indeed many of them have never heard of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They're simply working at the local and regional level to reduce poverty, improve health, improve education, improve healthcare, deal with water problems, deal with land issue problems, address climate change through mitigation or emissions reduction, and on and on and on. Improve justice. Well, what are these? These are the Sustainable Development Goals, are they not? And many of the targets under these goals are being met by people who don't even know these goals or targets exist. What are these networks? Each and every one of them is an experiment at the grassroots level in democratic participation. Some of them involve some element of formal government, maybe some element of a public-private partnership, but most of them are entirely outside government. So while we are shrinking the realm of democracy formally, we are increasing at the grassroots level and up the realm of democracy informally. And the world's not noticing. Because that's not, as my son, the trained journalist, will tell me, news. Nothing's been broken, so it's not news. Nothing's bleeding, so it's not news. And I'm a former journalist too in an earlier life, so I understand this. But simply because it's not news doesn't mean it's not important. And I would say that these endeavors, which are spurred and accelerated by the failures of governance, are arguably what's most important in how we're learning how to govern ourselves in the world. And in terms of a strategy for moving toward what I've described, what I propose in the book is that we emphasize these endeavors outside of government. We increase their numbers. We link them up geographically. We scale them up. And we begin to surround government. Now, there are some efforts underway that I wholeheartedly support and enthusiastically applaud, citizens' assemblies, citizen juries, and the like. There's going to be another Citizens Assembly at COP30 in Brazil in November. And to my amazement, the government of Brazil is being very actively supportive of it. I'm thrilled. And those efforts need to continue, but they need to expand. And I think the best way to expand it is by linking up the sustainable development efforts that are occurring worldwide, experiments in democratic participation that they are, with the democracy networks that are beginning to develop worldwide. And all of this is going to occur, in my view, mainly outside of traditional institutions of governance. But by doing this, I think we can, over time, begin to impress ourselves on these institutions, surround them, and do so to the point that it becomes politically necessary for them to recognize these efforts and eventually incorporate them in some fashion, either by incorporating it directly or duplicating it. And that's what I intend to devote the rest of my life doing.
We have a few minutes left. Do we have any more questions for Jim?
Announced got one from the chat.
Question. Very good question, too. Why did ancient democratic ideas around deliberation, sortition, etc., disappear from the public consciousness while ancient autocratic and militarist ideas, such as the Roman Empire, the Spartans, have remained so prominent? Is there anything we can do to make the democratic ideas more spreadable? Well, the obvious answer is we can spread them. But your question is a historical question, and it deals with how ancient Athens was viewed historically in the centuries after the democracy was defeated by the Macedonians. And of course, this has a lot to do with how the Romans portrayed it initially, because the Romans had no interest in democracy. But it continued up through the Middle Ages and up through the 18th century. And if you read the founders of our republic, although they believed on the one hand that representation was the second best form of direct democracy, at the same time, they were skeptical about democracy because everything that they'd read about ancient Athens said that it was mob rule. And well, what had they read? Well, as I discuss in my books, the people who were actually practicing democracy in ancient Athens, Cleisthenes and Pericles and Ephialtes and Demosthenes, they didn't bother to write books about it. They just did it. The people who wrote the books that we've inherited, like Plato, didn't much like democracy. They were elitists, and they portrayed it as mob rule. Well, what did the founders of the American Republic in the 18th century read in their studies? They read Plato. And a few others. The old oligarch and a few others. I won't go into all that detail, but by and large, they had the impression that the Athenian democracy was nothing other than mob rule. And it will be if it's not informed. This is why we need education and deliberation. When the Athenian assembly did not deliberate, they made some mistakes. Sicilian expedition, for example, and where they lost everybody and lost ultimately the Peloponnesian War because of it. But in the 19th century, there was a British scholar, one of these British men of letters that I envy. You know, I like to be a man of letters, or person of letters, you call it today. Although a lot of them, of course, lived on sugar slavery and a few other things. And here I wouldn't want to simply, but his name was George Grody. And he went back and he wrote, he was a member of the parliament. He was a reformer, one of those Whig reformers of the 1830s and 40s. And he wrote a 12-volume history of Greece. I found a complete 12-volume set, 150 years old, at a junkyard sale once, and I bought it for $5. Read it through and through. Now, he never mentions slavery. Okay, so it's ahistorical. But he does talk about how the democracy worked. And then in 1891, we discovered Aristotle's Constitution of Athens. It was an archaeological discovery, about 100 pages. We don't know whether it was written by Aristotle. It was probably written by one of his students at his instruction. But in that Constitution of Athens, he talks about direct democracy, about Cleisthenes, how it all worked. He emphasizes random selection, which had never been emphasized before. So there it all was. And what's happened is a new generation, a new century or more of Greek classicists has gone back, and through a lot of the scientific methods that are available to archaeologists and classicists today, they've been able to learn about a lot more about how ancient Greece and all the city-states worked at the time, including Athens. A very good question. I asked that question myself when I wrote the book, and this is part of the answer I came up with. It's in the book.
All right, so I think we've reached the end of our time. So maybe let's end it here and thank Jim.